All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Hope everyone can hear me okay. I will open the chat to verify. It is nice to be back. This is actually, it has been 6 months since my last Q&A. So it's nice to be back. We've been very active with the channel lately after the book tour with Derek Barn. And it was really amazing. One of the best things to... Yes, the Tutt shelf is here in the house. I apologize. I just got done playing soccer, so I just like washed my face, but you know, I'm still like I haven't taken a full shower, so TMI, but that's okay. It's good to see you guys. So yeah, so I have a good list of questions, but I also realized that a lot of your questions are overlapping, so I kind of have structured tonight's talk in a bit of a topical manner. And so we're going to talk about philosophy, some theoretical questions, but also a lot about current events and the state of the world. So yes, but the book tour was amazing. Again, the most exciting part of the book tour was like meeting people, like meeting the chat come alive, meeting people that actually follow the Patreon and that support this work that we're doing. It was genuinely amazing. Derek Barn and I do want to take the tour out west. There's plans to do that. And I will keep everybody up to date on our plans to do that. So I want to begin with, I think, a very interesting question here. We'll begin on the deep end. And in order to answer your questions, of course, I had to go back and consult literature, as I often do. So I was reading Ernesto Laclau to respond to this question that was posed about the relationship between Bonapartism and mass politics. And yeah, we'd love to come to the West Coast. The plan is to do Portland, which is my old stomping grounds, and then maybe do Oakland and then LA. We have a lot of comrades in LA. So yeah, let's try to make it happen. So anyways, let's kick it off with a question in regards to Bonapartism. So we talk about Bonapartism a lot, and I feel like maybe it's just me, but sometimes it might be one of those terms that bothers people that Marxists say it without defining it. And or it's the reverse, which is you are always having to define it. Because we should recognize that post-Marxism, post-quote-unquote Marxism, really tried to extinguish the theory of Bonapartism. And a lot of this came out of the Althusserian school. A lot of this came out of Nikos Poulantzas's work in state theory, where the basic premise also, and this is where Laclau comes into play, was a rejection actually of the Hegelian dialectic as a conception of class struggle. So if you go back and you read Laclau's early work on politics and ideology, and then you read where he talks about Bonapartism towards the end of the book, particularly in the Latin American context, which he refers to Perón, General Perón in Argentina, as a Bonapartist state leader. And then if you compare his treatment of Peronism there to his treatment of Bonapartism and Marx's 18th of Brumaire in On Populist Reason, his later text, you see a very interesting similarity. And that is related to this idea that Laclau wrote his dissertation on, which was the premise that embedded in 19th century Orthodox Marxism is a class reductionist theory of the state, but also of the political. You know, this concept, which somewhat comes out of the work of Carl Schmitt, but is generally very much like a continental philosophy idea of the political, meaning like how we account for a sequence of politics that's truly novel, or that rises to a hegemonic block, that can construct a hegemonic block of power, right? How does class struggle become hegemonic? How does class struggle become ignited into something that would truly be transformative? And Leclau says something very interesting, which was that the lumpen proletariat becomes a blind spot for Marx. And he basically confesses this in the Brumaire, because what the lumpen proletariat does to the thesis of the dialectic in Marx is that it basically shatters the idea that a single class, namely the proletariat, could function as the agent of a homogeneous bloc to produce the political or to guide the political. And rather, the theory of Bonapartism is sort of like the disintegration of all class logics, and the need, therefore, and this is the key point apropos populism, to construct a populist assemblage or solidarity bloc with the heterogeneous class interests. And so what he's trying to say is that Bonapartism, the theory of Bonapartism, kind of shoots the Marxist proposal of the proletarian-centered revolution in the foot. And that this is a thesis that haunts Marxism over and over and over. And this is why also he will make a very startling claim early on in his work when he first starts to write about populism, where he will basically suggest that even when you have a kind of working class-centered political sequence, the basis of its success will have to appeal to the people. It will have to compose itself not in any narrow way unto its own class interests. Now, I want to recognize that comrades like Matilda and Kolya Ludwig, who introduced me to Alan Shandro, have kind of tipped me off to this point, where they've basically said, look, in today's day and age, we cannot have a working class hegemonic politics because the interests of the working class are not capable of being scaled out to something that would be that, truly capable of representing the heterogeneity of all classes. So in that sense, this introduces us to something that we talk about in the book. And in the book of The People Are Not One, I think that one of our claims here is not that it's almost to agree with the premise that the working class cannot function as like the sole, arbiter of the universal class. But it's rather that they are the most strategically positioned class to center a solidarity bloc around, because they push a particular antagonism between capital and labor that other classes cannot push. And they are numerically the largest class, which gives them that numerical advantage. The challenge is both ideological as well as institutional, because the bourgeoisie has created barriers for the effective solidarity of the working class to truly take place, to truly transpire, right? So this leads us to the other thesis of our book, which we've been articulating at various events and podcasts, about this kind of necessity to construct working class institutions. So wonderful. We have Andrew, we have Matilda, we have the big Sig, we have Drea, I think it's Andrea, I believe is here, and many others who I vaguely recognize by your handles, but welcome to everyone. So anyways, what I found really interesting theoretically is that Leclau was rejecting the Hegelian dialectic because he thought that Marx's theory of class struggle, reliant on the proletariat, was a theory of dialectics, because he plays off of this notion of homogeneity of the class versus heterogeneity. And you could almost say that Leclau's whole premise is born from the fact that the political is representative of a total class breakdown. And so in a way, he really finds in Marx's thesis of the 18th of Brumaire of this idea of, you know how Derek Varn and I get this idea from Rancière as well, that the lumpenproletariat is this class of active disintegration of class interests. Laclau seems to think that this is sort of the foundation of bourgeois politics, right? That bourgeois politics, when it goes into crisis, one of its strategies of crisis management is to basically atomize the possibility of a coherent class interest. Now, I have the feeling that Laclau gets a bit opportunistic because he's so willing to fill that vacuum with non-materialist points of content to organize that ensemble of solidarity groups that you get a kind of hyper politics. That's a term that actually Isabel Garro uses in her critique of Laclau, not as Anton Jäger uses the term. That's what she criticizes Laclau's whole theory of hegemony to fall sway to. So, I mean, people can respond to that in the chat. I mean, but I think that the basic line I'm trying to say is that populism ultimately leads to Bonapartism. In a sense, yes, but we could put it differently by saying that populism signals some collapse in class coherence, and therefore populism signals an opportunity for the political or for class struggle. It signals that it's getting hot, that something is happening. Something is happening. And the work of pre-politics is extremely important, almost like the preparatory work for creating the ground to meet the crisis, to meet the future crisis when it happens. It becomes essential. And I feel that Laclau's model doesn't put too much onus on institution building, and it's too easily bound up with the existing status quo of liberal NGO and educational institutions. It's not critical enough of them, in my opinion. So that would be my response to that. There's more to be said about Bonapartism. One thing that we're going to talk about tonight is the interest that many people have raised about creating 101 videos, which would be like explanatory videos. And I know that there's many talented comrades in our community that might be able to help us with that. For example, I know that Greg has a lot of editing skills. I have writing skills. You know, Matilda's offered some to possibly help as well. So I think one of the things we're going to do at Emancipations is offer a little more 101 type things. So Bonapartism would qualify. And another thing we're going to do is offer more introductory lectures to key concepts that we talk about, so that people that are newer to this work don't get have more of a bearing on what it is we're talking about. The next question I find very endearing, and I'm not sure that I can even answer this question, and it's a little hilarious, but it's as follows. How do we get intellectuals to see the Marxist light and get them into organizations that help the working class, not necessarily in leadership roles, but in essentially educated and orienting the working class? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of a point that Derek Varn made in a recent conversation that we had on the book, where he made an assessment of salting, where you are, you know, usually a young militant, and you go into a job site, a factory site, and you try to agitate for union. And he was pointing to the fact that this is more and more becoming very difficult in the age of the kind of transparent algorithm and like the smartphone and hyper internet connectivity, and everyone can Google everyone, and it's very difficult to be anonymous. And so this old like Maoist idea of rustifying yourself to have solidarity with the proletariat is not what it used to be. for not only for these like extraneous technological reasons, but also because I think the contours of proletarianization in general, and I know it's a very mixed experience and takes many different forms, and it affects different sectors, it affects different geographies differently. It's not what it used to be, though, that's for sure. So a lot of the way that we used to think about radical militancy, I think, had the privilege of a middle class assumption. And privilege is the wrong word. I never like this term. I think it's imprecise word to use, but it had the trust that one could experiment for a period of time in doing radical politics and then go back to some kind of mainstream career, right? And so the first thing I would want to say is that, you know, educationally, that doesn't have to be the only model of thinking about how to be a political person, right? That's not to say, because I think, you know, I do want to recognize that even though our middle class has been like destroyed, there still is a lot of middle class people. And sometimes I speak very aggressively towards like the petty bourgeoisie, and I use pejoratives to tear down the middle class ideology. I do that out of an aggressive Marxist love, you know? It's not like some kind of hatred. That I have no hatred for the middle class. And I welcome class traders. I think that's the name of the game. And so first you have to ask, on what basis, on what class basis are we thinking about encouraging people to become a Marxist? Because if you spend any time at the university, you will know that anyone can call themselves a Marxist. Now, there's a liberal way to call yourself a Marxist where the superego that qualifies that is based on a logic of activism. How much activism you do sort of earns you sort of merit points, like you're in the Boy Scouts or something. And whoever the Marxist judge may be, I think in the 60s and 70s, it was like the professor, right? The professor would give you a good grade for your Marxist points. I think that model has collapsed. And I think that there is an acknowledgement that within bourgeois institutions, all of those old models are not really working. But one of the interesting things that happens in bourgeois politics, as we've seen lately, is that the old ways of thinking about things get pushed back onto you, and you're forced to confront, oh, okay, like, what were we thinking, and does it still apply? Like this whole thing we're going to get to later about the woke 1.0 and woke 2.0 is a perfect example of that, you see. But suffice it to say, what I'm precisely trying to say is that everyone has a kind of litmus test for what qualifies as a real Marxist. Yeah. Do not be reductive about that. Do not be class reductionist about that. Do not assume that the definition of a real Marxist is like based on some transitive theory. You know that paper that I gave on Lukács's History and Class Consciousness with the Center for Materialist Research, the School of Materialist Research, last summer, a year ago. I had this thesis of transitivity. And this is an important thesis I just want to articulate because it's related to this question. So the idea of transitivity is very interesting. Stalinism used to propose that class consciousness had a kind of transitivity to one's position within the division of labor. You could say it's almost like a causal, there's like a causal, but also like a truth quotient to my experience as a classed subject and my relationship to society or to social truth. It's like a big epistemological claim. Post-structuralism, one way to define post-structuralism philosophically, or even post-Marxism, is that Marxism has lost its transitivity. It's lost its class transitivity. So that efficacy is fractured of class experience. It's fractured. And here's the truth. I think the truth is that the post-structuralists are right. They are right about that, because in the culture as such, we would have to acknowledge that. But maybe they're right for the wrong reasons, or they're right for different reasons than I would say that they're right, if that makes sense. In other words, the liberalization of society and the marketization of society, you could also say the commodification of society, has extinguished the efficacy and the logic of class across the board, at an institutional level, at a cultural level, at a political level. That's why I'm always talking about starting at a base level, starting at a foundational level, to create new ways to see class. That's not to valorize the mode of production in which class transitivity had more efficacy. So I think the argument is rather that, say, in the Second International period, you could make the claim that class transitivity was more efficacious. This kind of, that the immediacy of, and this is related to the thesis of mass politics, of institutions that could viably or plausibly mediate class interests, resulted in a social order in which class was more legible. Today, class is highly fragmented. This is one of our main themes in our book, okay? So all of that is to say, don't be very, I mean, to be a Marxist, to advocate for real Marxism and to shine the light of Marxism, yes, you should have a pride, and there's a dignity, and there's a, it's a beautiful tradition, and it is like a tradition, I think. And it is, as we try to argue on our show and in our program, a very comprehensive tradition. You know, this is what the great philosophers of Marxism bequeath to us, from Engels to Lukács. They instruct us accordingly, even Karl Korsch, that Marxism is a way for us to understand science, to understand literature, to understand political economy, and so on, right? So we shouldn't lose sight of that. I think I would have to know what organizations you're talking about. What organizations are you trying to convert people to Marxism? Because the other thing I would say, if we take the example of like the Marxist Unity Group within DSA, who many of our comrades are a part of it, or they are supporters of it, and even Bill Maher, the, you know, liberal HBO comedian, you may have seen, did a whole thing, a whole spoof on the mug on Marxist Unity, which I found to be hilarious because they're like so close to us. It's always that uncanny, surreal experience when like, wait a second, I know these people, you know? But you know, they struggle. But you know that they have a righteous struggle, though. At the same time, we should be honest. Theirs is a righteous struggle because within DSA, I think that they become closest to holding down Marxism in a way that, for all of the problems that I have with DSA, I can at least respect like the rigor and the sincerity of what Mug is trying to do. I would just say that. So it's very much dependent. It's very much dependent. I think the final thing I'll say is that you should definitely use restraint. I don't think we should ever gatekeep who's a Marxist and who's not. The liberals have their own form of censorship. They have their own form of gatekeeping. We don't do that, and we shouldn't do that as best we can. We avoid that. So that's what I would say, you know, don't gatekeep, and don't be vulgar. You know, I think that's the other thing, is that we do have a lot of vulgar Marxism today. But it's very interesting. And like, you know, I kind of want to write an article after my interview with Edward Bering and his book Vulgar Marxism about the sort of Kautskian theory of vulgar Marxism all the way up through Gramsci. Because did you notice that McKinsey Works celebration of the label came only about, I don't know, 8 to 10 years ago, okay, when they were writing about the neo-feudal thesis and that capitalism is dead as a mode of production, okay? But the way that Wark celebrated vulgar Marxism was so actually qualitatively different, I think, than the Kautskian way of talking about it. So there has to be some analysis here. I also think that this emphasis on the accessibility of Marxism becomes extremely useful. And meaning that the right wing is, and we're going to talk about this later tonight, is in this weird hysterical moment where what we're seeing with the right wing after Mamdani has become more of a liberal. The paleo conservatives are beginning to recognize that Mamdani is actually not a Marxist. And they are hystericized because this whole signifier is like nonsensical for them. Anyways, I'll reference an interview that I was recently watching with Paul Gottfried, who's like this right-wing paleo-conservative student of Herbert Marcuse, where he's like, most Marxists that you see today are just post-Marxists, and they don't care anything about the economy. They just care about identity politics, you know, that whole thing. And so anyways, that's what I would say. It's a tough question, I think, but those are some sort of things to watch out for. 2 or 3 questions were asking me about wokeism, and I want to discuss that now. So there's an article that I reviewed for a journal, and it presents this incredible, and when I find out the author's name, I'm going to put this in the show notes. I think that they will be hopefully thankful that I reference their work. It shows that there were 3 stages of analysis when it came to wokeism from 2018 up to 2024. First, there were 25 predominant books, popular books written about wokeism from a center liberal point of view, from a left-wing point of view, and from a right-wing point of view. Okay. And it was the centrist liberals that initiated a whole series of reflections on wokeism, quote unquote. And these were works by Jonathan Haidt, John McWhorter, Yasha Munk, Andrew Doyle, this guy Gad Saad, who's this Israeli Zionist guy who just terrifies me. And all of these works were seeking to analyze wokeism through the prism of ideology, morality, psychology, and culture. So they were thinking that it's basically about beliefs, but they had really no conception of class, of power, or of state. And it was really about victimhood culture. They understood wokeism as the proliferation of victimhood culture. A lot of them understood wokeism as a new form of religion, as a kind of continuation of some typically Protestant form of religiosity. And there were some basically arguments that you had a sense that it was largely coming from the academy, but they had no real rigorous analysis of like what academic disciplines or trends were truly perpetuating wokeism. So that's the first set of work on wokeism. The second was from the left. And from the left, wokeism was theorized in the wake of the failure of Sanders, largely in 2020, but also the failure of 2016, by figures like Walter Ben Michaels, Adolph Reed, Musa al-Gharbi, Christian Parenti. And here, the centerpiece of the logic of what drives wokeism is the PMC. The professional managerial class created an ideology that sought to legitimate their social position. This could be understood as the kind of moniker of these works. Of course, all of the works from these authors are very dynamic and singular in their own ways, and they're worth reading, of course. But then you have a third mode of analysis of what wokeism is from the right. And what defines these works, such as Richard Hanania, Christopher Rufo, Christopher Caldwell, and Joel Kotkin, is the notion that law and state power is at the origin of wokeism. So here they're pulling from elite theory. They're pulling from this notion of the long march through the institutions. This is where they get the critique of Marxism from, or a kind of vulgar Gramscianism from, right? And that basically for the right, wokeism represents the civil rights movement and its inertia into a state bureaucratic repressive regime. Okay. And what's very interesting, okay, so that's, I think, helpful. That's, I think, helpful to navigate sort of liberals think of wokeism as basically belief and ideology, right? Without a conception of power. The left, these left critics like Adolph Reed and Musa al-Gharbi and Walter Ben Michaels, think of wokeism pretty much purely through class lens, primarily. And the right thinks about wokeism vis-a-vis the status of the state and the law and the legal apparatus. Now, the author of this piece makes a beautiful argument that I had never thought about before, which is that what the left misses when we come to think and diagnose and even cogitate on what wokeism is the idea that embedded in the critique of the state form is a theory of Bonapartism. So the whole theory of Bonapartism comes back. And here, he basically argues that basically the socialist left has to recognize and face with very sober eyes the reality that the legacy of the new left did construct a bloated bureaucratic state apparatus that has failed to adequately function, even to deliver the basic provisions of welfare that it purports to deliver in the age of neoliberalism. And that what's so often missing in our understanding of what drives wokeism is the internal fracturing of this bureaucratic state machinery. And so what I found interesting is that what propels, therefore, the moral panics, and I would even say the questions that I got about woke 1.0 versus woke 2.0 are some variations on the Stuart Hall thesis of the moral panic, which by now you are all familiar with after reading Derek Varnenai's book, about like this is this sort of a device of the ruling class in a certain way. It's a device of the state to manage and pacify social discontents and basically to stomp down rebellion, right? Because you see, embedded in the debate that AOC kicked up in her interview is a very interesting problematic, which is a bit of like what in cybernetic theory is referred to by Gregory Bateson as a double bind, in the sense that I cannot disavow the righteous element that birthed woke 1.0. And nor would I ever want to encourage any of you to pretend that there was not a kernel embedded in the uprising of Black Lives Matter that was not 100% emancipatory. And moreover, one could even invoke a Badiouian lens to understand this uprising as a sort of return of the great communist invariant of a kind of yearning of the masses. So, of course, the tragedy of bourgeois politics is that when something like that emerges, we have no infrastructure, right, to properly allow it to properly channel those energies towards an emancipatory and liberated end. Instead, we face, what Joshua Clover calls the problem of communication, this kind of envelopment of co-optation. And that's what happened with quote unquote woke 1.0. And I think that the state, and what this article made me realize, is that the state plays a very important role in that process. And I would even say that as we're witnessing Mamdani and AOC and all of this social democratic and left populist energy having to integrate its radicalism into the Democratic Party, the radical left is faced with a real question, which is that on what basis are our demands for linking up with this radicalism to be understood? Because then we almost have like a philosophical question on our hands, which is, on what basis are we to understand this abstract appeal of the masses? Because concurrent to its emergence, and of course, if you ever participated in a protest, whether it be BLM or whether it be Occupy or whether it be against the war in Iraq or whether it be like a strike at your workplace or anything like that, when you've ever been a part of the movement, there are some people who think that like all of that's fake, because you see the forces of co-optation are so immense today that we have a lot of young people that have lost that fundamental feeling of politics. And this is essential. My critique of left liberals and even of some Marxists would be that they presume that the porousness of emancipatory energies can be harbored or sort of live within liberal institutions in some kind of copacetic or even agitated way. What I think we find instead is that the state tends to have the upper hand, and that what we have is what I often refer to as the politics of paternalism coming to haunt the left when the left is ensconced in these elite institutions. Because we see this a lot, is that a lot of people on the left have, because of their own reliance on and their own dependence with elite institutions, they tend to have a very uncritical view of them. And this is something that I'm highly critical of. And the final thing I'm going to say here is that this author makes a beautiful point, which is that the Debsian Socialist Party was interested in constructing a rival apparatus to the Bonapartist state capture, precisely because the stakes of what we know as wokeism, let's just take wokeism as the pejorative captured version of the original righteous agitation. That's what we're calling wokeism. The author makes the nice point that that co-optation, right, harms the prospect of liberty itself. So the proposition of the achievement of socialism as a liberating movement will inevitably become ensnared in the Bonapartist state if we do not break from this like new left welfare state. And here it becomes very tricky, because the other thing that I didn't mention here is that on the terrain of the bourgeois state, the demands that are permitted to be negotiated tend to be particularistic, identitarian-based demands, because that's what's allowed on that terrain. Class demands are not able to be truly formulated on that terrain, or to the extent that they are, it's going to be very rare. And usually it will be like through acts of Congress for certain advancements in labor or legal rights, things of this nature. But most of the time it's constrained by a civil, bureaucratic, administrative state that will narrow the field of demands, which is why populism becomes like this initial outlaw movement that's trying to make demands for class interests, right? Initially it's flawed, but it represents something. So that's what I would say about wokeism. Let's keep our focus on the woke problem at a higher level, at a meta level. I think that the issue also has to be understood through race, in the sense that the origin of the term comes from the Black radical movement itself. And on Wednesday, I'm going to be interviewing August Nims, the author of Black Marxism, and we're going to get into a lot of this stuff, because I do think that one of the things we should also recognize, apropos the left-wing critique of wokeism, is that while it may have a strong truth valence in terms of its class analysis, have you noticed that it also has the capacity to erode solidarity and forge irrationalism within left-wing culture spaces? So there has to be, and this is why like we feel like, in The People Are Not One, we have to have another way of getting at the PMC without this excessive dimension to it. So, because the other thing is that affective politics become the preferred form of politics when you have a bourgeois dominated media apparatus. And so most of what we know as wokeism appears as particularistic identitarian demands that are highly affectively charged. And I will say also that there are state actors that are very nefarious, that are very aware that affective politics is very, very disruptive. And that's why they like to use the wokeism, because they know how divisive it is. Afro-pessimism is not really something I'm thinking about here. Afro-pessimism is not really an actualized element of wokeism. I think it's more of a very particular academic expression. And I'm not even sure that Afro-pessimism, I've heard many people theorize Afro-pessimism more as an anti-politics. I would say most wokeism is a hyper-politics, right? I would also say, moreover, that Marxists have a duty to come into dialogue with woke political actors. And one of the things that I've seen, even though I've had very vociferous conflicts with people over this issue, I have seen the capacity for bridge building to take place. And I think it's necessary. This kind of goes back to this question about real Marxism that we were looking at earlier. I think we're at that stage now. It goes back to also my point about the middle class, which is like, yes, we need to have this like strong polemical force with these matters. Like, we are opposed to identity politics, but on like strong materialist basis. Also on the sense that, we are not class reductionists. We are trying to rethink and recenter class as a method for overcoming its oppression. That necessitates actually digging into it, right? I think one of the things with the wokeism is you do get the problem of what we call ABC theory, anything but class, right? Anything but class. And that's super problematic. ABC stuff is everywhere with this. And it's weird because you need a bit of psychoanalysis to understand it. Insofar as like in psychoanalysis, you can have something which you are repressing, but the very basis of what you are repressing is like the hidden truth of that which you don't want to confront. I think you see that a lot with like ABC wokeism, and in some cases you may not even be able to dialogue with people at that level, and they just need to be absorbed into the liberal apparatus and they will learn, but I would say as much engagement as we can have, strong engagement, firm in our principles, but still engagement would be necessary in my view. Now, one of the things that's very interesting though, in the wake of the Iran war, the state of the right is in a very, very, very precarious place right now, intellectually. On the one hand, the inflation and the cost of living crisis, compounded with Trump's alliance with Zionism, has forfeited the Christian right, the sort of the Zionist Christian right compact is totally lost its efficacy. The whole notion of the prosperity gospel and all of that like evangelical right cannot viably function in these economic conditions, on the one hand. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, there is a growing realization that on the left, the right is not facing a bunch of hardcore revolutionaries. Rather, they are facing, pretty run-of-the-mill, middle-class, elite, liberal progressives like Mamdani. And so I was listening to this interview with Paul Gottfried, where it was very funny because he was hystericizing the people interviewing him from the Claremont Institute, because he was basically saying, we have nothing to worry about from Mamdani, because Mamdani is not really a Marxist. And a true Marxist would actually be interested in strong materialist analysis, economic justice. And he even invokes this idea that, well, in most communist societies, they're fine with the conservative culture and so on. And I found it very interesting because the person interviewing him was younger, and they had never thought about why that form of Marxism would be dangerous, because the only way they could think about Marxism was through this like hyper-cultural lens. And I found it such a kind of cosplay. And this is why I call it hysterical, because they have no idea who it is they are up against. And when the right realizes that at the core of the left is not that it's like your fantasy of it, what you have projected of it is so hyperbolic, when that becomes demystified, and I'm not celebrating Gottfried at all, but I'm just saying that he simply demystified it for them, they didn't know what to say or do. And moreover, it was evident to me, and I'll share the link in the show notes. It was evident to me also that a lot of the right functions purely as a reaction to their hyperbolic projection of the radical left. And it's very interesting because, in a sense, what they are saying is that we are in woke 2.0, and that Hassan Piker and Mamdani and AOC have brought us to woke 2.0. And what is that defined as for them? That is defined as a moderate turn away from cultural radicalism towards an economic first orientation. What do you guys think of this? I don't really buy it. I don't really see it. I mean, in a way, it would be nice if that were true. What I find very interesting, though, is that a lot of people on the radical left have actually criticized AOC, Mamdani, and so on for pushing away from their cultural radicalism. So they define woke 1.0 as full throttle cultural radicalism, right? And then woke 2.0 is like, this is very strange to me. This is very interesting to me. I also predict that the Democratic Party is already prepared, like moving the strings to set the radical left up, not necessarily to be scapegoats, but to contain them. So I think we have a very interesting problem right now, which is that we have basically lost our referent to the masses. So this idea of BLM and woke 1.0 having this viable touch to a palpable uprising of the political, which we participated in a real, like, tactile way, and it was there, and so on. We now lack that. We now lack that, and we could make an itinerary of reasons as to why we lack that in some sense, right? The conditions post-pandemic, conditions of social isolation, I would say conditions of general sort of feelings of despair and unease in the culture, a whole number of crises. But moreover, the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, became this another kind of traumatic whiplash moment in which the left tried to latch onto a palpable touch with, like, a movement, but it seemed to slip away from us. It seemed to slip away from us. So the question that I think that militants have, right, is, do we advocate the valorization of cultural radicalism without a critical analysis of institutions which we know will not deliver on that cultural radicalism? And then we become the playthings of puppet masters that know full well that all we want are symbolic recognition for cultural radicalism. We can't do that. We can't go down that road. There has to be inculcated a sense of responsibility for the situation. And we have to shine the light of truth on this complicity that these institutions have with what they do with that cultural radicalism. Where does it go? Most of the times it goes into the abyss. It goes into a kind of, I don't know, like some kind of neoliberal evaluative report card. Do you know what I mean? It becomes almost like quantifiable, right? So it's a very alienating situation institutionally to be, and this is why people are losing their trust in the left. This reminds me of the great essay that I love to invoke by Kowakowski on the meaning of the left and why I'll never abandon the left. Because even in the darkest of moments, it is essential that we maintain the universal principles of what anchors us. I just think that the institutions around us cannot fully meet those realities, is what I'm trying to say. So is there some truth to woke 1.0 and woke 2.0? I think if we go back to my 3-part analysis, we should operate first and foremost beyond this dichotomy. I didn't even say anything about anti-woke. Obviously, I'm opposed to it. I think for just basic reasons, we should all be opposed to anti-wokeism. One, because it's too imprecise in its allegiance with the right-wing element of those institutions. So what anti-wokeism does is it makes a compact with liberal institutions, but from the right, you know? And this is why, like, I don't publish in the Atlantic or Compact magazine. I'm not going to judge people that publish in the Atlantic or Compact, like right-wing liberal groups, right? Like people like Tyler Austin Harper, TAH, who's a very interesting writer, and he's actually been on Emancipations. People are trying to say that he doesn't qualify as a leftist because he writes for the Atlantic, and that's like a right-coded. Although, you know, didn't Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote his big essay on reparations for the Atlantic? Did he not? Somebody can verify that. Somebody can verify that. Chris is asking, who is we? About 4 minutes ago. I don't know the context. You'll have to remind me. So that would be my point, you see, which is, I think that a lot of this woke politics also presumes a highly self-righteous way of conduct that has totally relinquished the benefit of the doubt and like just general comradely charity to people. It often refuses to see the best in people. And I think that as Marxists, when I say we, I'm saying my conception of how we as Marxists should operate. That's my conception. So when I'm saying we, that's what I mean by that. But also I'm using the conception of we as an invitation for our collective to think this together. Of course, that doesn't mean that I'm trying to force it on you, but that's what I mean by we. We in an ideal sense. And yes, there's totally pictures of the Atlantic's editor with Ghislaine Maxwell. Of course, no, this is why I would never publish with them. It's kind of gross, just at that pure basic level, for sure. And I think that I would like to ask someone like Tyler Austin Harper what his theory of change is, as it pertains to, like, okay, he's probably like a kind of left-wing populist reformer of some sort. How is he dealing with the feedback that he gets as a socialist writing for the Atlantic? My assumption is that the Atlantic culture doesn't think that there are socialists that they would ever take seriously. Or they would think that he is the exception. And so there's no we. There's no we, right? Who is we? We are atomized individuals. How dare you associate a we? No, I'm very much in line with the notion that we should use we as an open thing. I don't think we should have this atomized individualist approach. Did he go full Kamala? Oh my God, I hope not. Jesus. I mean, maybe lately. I mean, I'll have to have him back on the show. I mean, he's, first of all, he's a sweet, thoughtful, interesting guy, you know. And I'll also say that, you know, the way that he was treated after his article by some people on the left was really heartbreaking, you know, where people were trying to say like question, like, oh, are you secretly resentful because you got denied tenure at Bates College and that's why you're writing this? And it's just like, really? It's just like, come on, man, you know? like, you have to take a critique like the one that he made of this excessive liberal culture that he expressed in his piece, which I can link to. You have to take the good and the bad with it. And certainly he exposed a lot. What I find very interesting is that I was talking to right-wing liberals, and they expressed something for the first time, a solidarity against excessive liberalism, let's call it wokeism for lack of a better word, but after reading his article. Then I thought to myself, that's his function, is to kind of allow liberals who are too quiet to criticize woke a chance to criticize it now. I think there's another way for us to be critical of woke. I'm not of the view that woke is like some sacred thing that cannot be criticized. I just don't know how we could even proceed in this way. There's some people on the left that do believe that, though. And, it's, I think there has to be a better way. And, this brings me to the next question, which was about René Girard. And I'm not going to get into the depths of Girard's theory of mimesis and of mimetic rivalry, other than to say a few things that interest me about René Girard. And I wrote about this in my first book, and I can share the chapter on this with you guys. But I find him very interesting as a philosopher of a particular orientation to Silicon Valley ideology, which is that, are you guys aware that Girard's, you could kind of summarize Girard's approach to capitalism as being pro-monopoly, anti-competition. And he wants to think of the creation of institutions that have transcended the problem of mimetic rivalry. And so ultimately, it's a paradox, because the heart of the neoconservative, the paleoconservative, of modern conservative thought, libertarian thought, etc., of course, we know is premised on the valorization of competitive individualism. Now, you could say that Girardianism is far away from the Dark Enlightenment and Peter Thiel and all of that. But in fact, in a sense, it's actually not, based on the way that they read Girard. So the way that they read Girard, in fact, is that they want to create kind of neo-aristocratic institutions as enclaves, almost like sheltered from market competition, in which, and this is why I finally think I have a theory as to why Peter Thiel has bankrolled and supported incel, the incel phenomenon. You wonder why he funded that documentary with some people that we know were actually in it. It's very strange. But it's a kind of neo-Nietzschean theory that if we create a class of subservient men who have basically been infantilized, they are prepared to be perfect servants to a new elite, right? So what Thiel is basically trying to do is a kind of dark Girardian move to basically create a new class of obedient slaves to the new elite in an unquestioning, reflexive way, right? And it's something that I've written about, but when I wrote about it, these guys were not in power. We didn't have Project 2025. We didn't have literal fascists running these institutions, trying to destroy these institutions. We didn't have that. Now it's taken this extremely dark turn. you know? And in a moment, we're going to talk about the tragedy that I think built up to the Jason Arday case, which I think is an outgrowth of this wider neo-fascist turn in our culture. But what I find interesting for a left-wing appropriation of René Girard's thought about mimetic violence would be the idea that he's right, that institutions need to handle the problem of what he calls the scapegoat and construct a way to basically manage like social aggression, is his argument. It's a very psychoanalytic idea. And he's a great reader of Freud. He's definitely very interesting to read. You can go back to the study group we did on violence and the sacred many years ago. It was a pretty good study group. I think some of you may have been a part of it. I'd like to do another analysis of Girard. Girard's foundation, or Peter Thiel's foundation, gives money out to study Girard. And I was always thinking like, maybe we should like apply to do like some grant with them. But of course now it's impossible because they've gone off the deep end. And it would be very interesting if René Girard was alive today to see the state of the right and how absolutely insane it is. Another reason, of course, why the right is in a total shamble right now is the fallout from not only the war in Iran, but the fallout from the Charlie Kirk assassination. I don't know how many of you guys have followed the fallout from the Kirk assassination, like Candace Owens and all of this shit. It has been very, very interesting because, you know, the basic thing here is that the right is in shambles. The right is in shambles. It's amazing. I've never seen actually anything like it. Effectively, here's what's going on. If I could just like summarize it very quickly. The Zoomer and millennial element that Kirk's TPUSA represented and brought Trump into power, probably 90% of it believes that he was assassinated through like a deep state operation a la JFK. Okay. They literally believe that. Candace Owens has the most popular podcast in the world. She did a show a couple days ago, 3 million views, right? Nobody gets her kinds of numbers, right? I've thought to myself, could it be that Owens is also a deep state agent? And I have no way of knowing, of course, but I do find it odd that she traveled to Russia and that she's like in that like joke, because like Joe Kent was definitely what they call a limited hangout, right? And so the whole thing that's happening now is that Tucker, Joe Kent, and that guy from Tennessee, the anti-Zionist guy who lost, forget his name, who was on the Epstein files, they're starting like a third party, but it's a total mirage. It's totally fake. What it is they're trying to organize people while Israel manipulates Trump to do the war in Iran, to organize the right for a temporary period. Then they'll cancel it and they'll send everybody to vote for Vance. That's all that's going to happen. That's all that's going to happen. So the third party thing with Tucker Carlson is a total mirage. But I also think that Tucker is a kind of deep state agent as well. So I can't really trust Candace or them. But look, they're all at the point now where they think the Butler assassination, the Charlie Kirk assassination, the other fake one at the White House press corps dinner, they literally think that they're all orchestrated by Israel. And you know what is even funnier? And I actually like them for this. You know what they think Fuentes is? Is they call him the Fed. They think that Fuentes is fully a federal agent, which I think he is too, actually. So anyways, the right is in shambles and it's beautiful. I think it's actually quite nice. We could talk about it more. But I want to turn to a question that I got about the tragedy that happened in the UK. And I just want to start by expressing my my profound sadness and just to honor the madness and to honor the, not the madness, but just the tragic way that this whole thing played out, and to realize that what this man faced was a racist assault that we just have to acknowledge was monstrous, you know, monstrous. I think there was some over 200 stories done on him just within a few days. Basically, every major newspaper had done a story on his fraudulence, on his plagiarism, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you can go back and ask the question, were these allegations warranted? Did he really plagiarize his dissertation or not? And I've studied a bit of it. I think more, we're going to learn more. And I think his autobiography is still being published, so people are going to learn more about all of that. But what I find very interesting here is that I went back and I studied the scholar Kofnes. I think it's Jason Kofnes is his name, who broke the story. This guy is a right-wing scholar of biology and heredity. It's like he's a hereditarian reductionist. And I listened to many of his interviews and read his Substack. And I read, of course, the initial takedown that he tried to do of Jason Arday. I don't know if anyone else read his stuff. And there was a debate that he got in where he tried to argue something very interesting. And this goes directly to his interpretation of Nietzsche, which is that he argued, even before the Jason Arday affair, that left-wing elites lie because this is in their physiology, it's physiognomic, and it is a part of their essence as a person. So they therefore, their physiology speaks through them, and when it speaks through them, it can only appear to rational individuals as a lie. So therefore, ontologically, the plebeian intellectual, and here we should be honest, just like Bronze Age pervert, they claim, at least outwardly, and this would be very Nietzschean, that their eugenics, hereditarian, hierarchical theories are indifferent to racial difference. They claim that. Okay. And this was actually a debate that you can go look between Kofnes and Bapp, where they both acknowledge that both white and blacks can have degeneracy. And the issue is to find the higher types across races. And this, of course, they apply to the Jewish community as well, just like Nietzsche did. So the forces of socialism, of the left, of democracy and liberalism and so on, of egalitarianism as such, they take that general Nietzschean line that all of those forces conceal a truth beneath them that is housed within the body. And so this explains why many of these neo-Nietzscheans had a total emotional and affective indifference to the suffering that they brought upon this man when they attacked him in the way that they attacked him. A total indifference. And it's that indifference that I think should be the source of something that does not make us sympathetic or moralistic, but it should make us politically enraged. Right? That should force us to flip the table completely. I mean, this is kind of like the old, like Jack London reverse reading of Nietzsche, you know, against the eugenicists in a certain way. But it's hard when you realize it. Like somebody was saying, you know, BAP many years ago, 5-6 years ago, Bronze Age pervert, said that his politics could be defined as something worse than fascism. Again, because he's of the view that racists are reductionist vulgarians. They're not ready to go deeper because they're not willing to purge the deformed within their own given race. They're too almost like identitarian. You see the madness that we're dealing with here. Do you see the madness that we're dealing with here? And so a lot of the way that this appears, I think, to liberals, of course, is kind of like a straightforward racism. And it is a straightforward racism. But it's also like more than that. It's also something more monstrous than that. And because its ambition sees the reconstitution of a form of the human that would be beyond, or that would be willing to cleanse in a total way. Or you see, it kind of functions in two ways. One is this like militant genocidal ethics that would be eliminationist, or they will have another moment of repose where they will say, if society is not ran by the weaker types, then we can get along. So the debate that happened between Bronze Age pervert and this guy Kofnes, whatever his name is, I may be mispronouncing his name, I don't care, revolved around Kofnes wanted to do a march through the institutions to purge the inferior elite. But you have to notice that he's not really setting his sights at the ideology of these people. He's setting his sights at the physiology of these people. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't invoke our comrade Conrad Hamilton, who made a very nice point that because the educational system in the Anglo-American universe at the university level does not do quotas based on class, or does so very, very poorly, let's say, the liberal establishment compounds and creates these types of crises where you have working class people thrown into these environments where they are basically forced to ventriloquize and play a part, right, for these liberal overlords that creates immense pressure on them. But the material point of their origin and their background, of course, when you're in these institutions, functions on a kind of blindness of equality, a fake liberal equality, of course. And Conrad made the interesting point that in France, they have created at least a system that is more inclusive because it pulls from socioeconomic data for its analysis of employees. So the problem is less pronounced in France. Because I would contend that yes, it's about race, and that yes, the centrifugal point about what the liberal media did to him has to be understood through that lens. But at the same time, if we don't privilege, or at least point to the fact that this man came from the equivalent of what we would call in the US the projects, in the UK, right? Right? Then what are we doing? Like if we don't, and again, we don't have the full composite picture of like the social psychological pressures that led Arday to become Arday, and right, that forced him into these pressurized environments where he felt that he had to lie in order to get by, right? So there's a class analysis there that's waiting to be analyzed and waiting to be brought to the surface that I hope will come. The final thing I'll say here is how monstrous it is, monstrous, that the liberals in the academic Cambridge elite academia created a letter that followed in lockstep with the advice that came from this eugenicist right-wing Nietzschean guy, Kaufmann, to begin with. He started it. And they fell along with him. And I've seen this letter. I could probably pull it up, but the names on the letter are some of like the leading British academics, and there's a few American academics as well. I find it very interesting that Brian Leader, the liberal Nietzschean at the University of Chicago, has put his name on the letter. There's many dynamics here. I liked Jason and Pascal's breakdown of the situation. I think that, you know, many of us know what it's like to exist in these spaces. And this kind of goes back to the woke problem and its excessive irrationalism. I'll never forget once to share a little anecdote about how these spaces can actually truly create weird situations that really fracture solidarities, but also like just fracture like the truth of social reality. I was once in the campus of Berkeley in about 2017, 2018, at the peak of when a lot of these energies were very present in liberal institutions. It was my first time at a very elite school, and I was giving a lecture. And I gave my lecture, but while I was giving the lecture, I noticed that there was a young Black woman in the audience who was starting to cry. And she was very emotional. And then I noticed that other people in the audience were very angry. They were very angry with me. And at the end, the Q&A was super tense. And I didn't know what I did wrong, right? And basically towards the end of the Q&A, it was almost as if like I was like laughed off of the stage. I was meant to be shamed, right? But it was initiated by this young woman crying. I come to learn at the end that the organizers had encouraged every white person who spoke to renounce their white privilege before they spoke, but they never told me to do that. And because I didn't do that, this young woman started to cry because she thought that it was like some personal offense that I didn't do that to her personally. But then here's where things get even more convoluted and where the materialist element becomes very essential. Because I don't think that she was crying just because I didn't renounce my white privilege. I came to learn that she recently had a mother who, it was either a mother or an aunt or a close family member die in her family. And incidentally, I had lost my stepmother, largely, frankly, through a death of despair type of event. Let's say we both had deaths, which were most productively understood, at least intellectually, how we analyze them through class forces and lens. But the liberals that organized this conference totally foreclosed the possibility of me and this young woman having any solidarity with what we shared in common at this class material level, right? That's what I mean when these institutions cannot function to represent social reality. That's just one little example. But I felt profound shame. I went to bed that night feeling as if I had done something wrong at the root of my being. And it was very, very difficult, in fact. So every time we attack somebody at this level of public shaming, right? It's very interesting because a lot of us studied, Lacan's great insights into shame, And I would claim that the politicized version of shaming people that functions in today's public sphere has just gone awry. It does not produce, like, this old Fanonian idea that shame is kind of like a catalyst for politicization, that there's a kind of political function to shame. I think that in certain conditions of strong social oppression that are like colonial style oppression, that thesis maintains a truth quotient. But in this situation that we're in, of these kind of bourgeois dominated middle class institutions, I don't see the directionality of public shaming as producing political effects. And moreover, a lot of the time that people shame, they're actually trying to conceal something in the act of shaming that is like taboo, or that they're afraid to face, right? Or even like they're trying to compensate for something that they're trying to keep hidden when they shame, So it's very difficult, I wrote a piece about this on my Substack in response to Taiwo, the Elite Capture author, where I kind of pushed against his valorization of shame as a political tactic. I'm not sure that it is anymore. Although, maybe I'll say it this way. If we Marxists regain power somehow, I would propose we re-investigate the efficacy of shame. Right? Okay. Rest in peace to this. I mean, it's just so tragic to look at his face, because he's such a sweet person. I mean, you could just tell that he's clearly put into a situation. Jason Arday is put into a situation where, I mean, it just makes me so sad, that he was forced into this situation. He didn't deserve this. And, I remember when I was with my mother and I lived in an apartment and shit was very rough, and I could feel the social anxiety and the pressure to lie about my condition. And like, that was like I feel like, even though I checked the DSM, right? I checked the DSM to see if the psychiatric and psychological establishment had come up with a theory for how poverty compels us to lie. And according to my research, there is no psychological designation for that. But I think that there should be. In fact. And moreover, it takes it's a dereliction on these institutions. It's a dereliction of their duty, that they couldn't see that they had created this elaborate scheme to force this man to lie in the way that he did. There's some responsibility that needs to be had, and I just hope that these people have a certain reckoning with that. You know, I really do. I have another question here on film and class from a great comrade in Turkey. I believe that I pronounce your name Gozda, but I could be mispronouncing that, and if I am, I apologize. She is writing about representation of class experience in cinema and literature, and asking if I believe emancipatory power of certain aesthetic regimes in cinema can capture class differences in experiences. I definitely think so. And I think that, you know, Jacques Rancière's work on the emancipated spectator is pretty interesting in this regard, insofar as Rancière sort of argues that whether in literary form or in cinematic form, you have a problem repeat whereby the working class subject is often represented by the professional, the director, the intellectual, whatever have you. And the way that they usually get around that is they bring in non-standard professional actors, non-trained actors. Like, so for example, this is very evident in my favorite film director of all time, John Cassavetes, where half of his cast are professional actors and the other half are not trained at all. And I feel like that's an interesting way. And this guy, Ken Loach in the UK, also does the same thing. So I think paying attention to filmmakers that do that, that mix their cast like that, can elicit a lot of dynamism on screen, and it starts to blur. Like, so in Cassavetes' work, you're not really sure who's a professionally trained actor and who's not, in a certain way. And I think that's one way around this problematic of like what you're calling the aesthetic regime, right? And moreover, I mean, I think, you know, in literature, it's interesting. I noticed that Sally Rooney, who's, you know, a millennial Irish writer, short like Normal People and so on, you know, when she's interviewed, this kind of goes back to this question about real Marxism, you know. She said it so brilliantly. She's like, I aspire to be a Marxist novelist. I aspire to that. I wish that I could attain that. I would be, if somebody said that I'm a Marxist writer, I would be honored, you know? And I think what she really meant there is that to do justice to class in literature is not easy. It's not easy to do that. So I think you'd have to have that humility going into it, you know? That's what I would say to that. So in essence, it's definitely possible, but it's rare. Okay, now moving right along. A question about my intellectual journey. I've been wondering for a while what you have kept and what you have discarded over the course of your intellectual trajectory. You've largely moved away from a lot of French theory you were trained in. But is there anything that you continue to see as valuable from that tradition? Oh, sorry. From that tradition, any thinkers, orientations, concepts, or general intuitions that you remain committed to, or that you think may have particular utility today? Yeah, this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about some elements of like post-structuralist thought and even, French theory itself. Like, it's all a matter of degree. So let's take the Deleuze and Guattari debate. 4 years ago, I had my debate conversation with Catherine Liu, and many people that come to Emancipations, they will have watched that video, and their response is, and even Deleuze and Guattarians say this, They say, well, clearly, Catherine is correct that that mode of doing politics is no longer useful for us. And then my rejoinder to her was, I kind of agree, but I'm open to the repertoire of their concepts, and maybe in Thousand Plateaus, things become less intensified and some of these concepts are more workable, and so on. And I think that this is an interesting topic, right? It's a difficult topic because the vitriol that I have had with the left Nietzscheans and the Deleuze is very high after I wrote my book on Nietzsche, okay? And I recognize that. And I think at some point we just need to honor that we have this difference. We need to honor that we have this difference. Alex Tae-Kwang Lee, the South Korean communist philosopher, he probably will come back on my show, because remember, I think it's not so productive to say, is XYZ thinker useful or not? It's rather to say, to what extent is XYZ thinker's thought capable of being absorbed by a particular form of left liberal ideology that effectively determines its course and direction and squashes its emancipatory possibility. When it comes to Deleuze, it's very difficult to salvage much of Deleuze for politics, precisely because so much of what he constructed was founded in the fulcrum of an anti-Marxism and something that was very in line with the liberal project. That's the problem there. Now, of course, I can read, his wonderful, speaking of literature, go read on the superiority of Anglo-American literature. And of course, only Deleuze in his aristocratic way could write a text with the title On the Superiority of Something, right? Only a left Nietzschean could say that, right? It would be very weird for a Marxist to say, on the superiority of this, the left Nietzscheans can get away with these little things. But I also, as I've said many, many times, there's also, I think, what Kluskard gives us is a way to see the way that a thinker's project also formulates a certain clientele and class relationship that is bound up with it. So a lot of these thinkers from French theory have been sucked into the theory industry, but also to some extent are relics of a praxis that's based on a certain thesis about capitalism that's no longer relevant. Okay. Badiou would probably be the one thinker that I would say to you is the mandatory thinker of all of these figures, who must be engaged with, who must be wrestled with, whose thought is the most systematic and the most important to engage. Of course, you should read all of these thinkers. I just think that the certain elements of their thought, as it pertains to their political utility and strength, just need to be seriously rethought. Okay. Now, when it comes to concepts, I could make an itinerary of concepts that I find interesting from this wider, from Foucault to Derrida to Bataille, right? It's possible. I think that there are elements of Foucault's genealogy that are absolutely stuff that I incorporate into my own thinking. Foucault's challenge to Marxism, one of the great things Assad Haider did, the late, great Assad Haider, was he was able to show what Foucault can give to Marxism. Not necessarily through this Rockhill lens of we analyze Foucault based on whether he believed in Marxism or not. It's almost too theological of a lens to analyze the problem. It's more what does this concept give to us? And I do think that even in Deleuze's Control Society essay, they do give us a way to understand the new apparatus of power. Like, you know how we're talking about the state and Bonapartism and so on, and our understanding of wokeism. You can have a very specific reading of Deleuze's control societies that could potentially add to that. It's hard to do because Deleuze also is this like hyper seductive thinker. So people have an attachment to him that becomes quite emotional. So it's hard. You need a kind of like a detached, respectful reading of him, if it makes sense. And then I think you can play with the Deleuze stuff. And Chris says Badiou's the only one who makes sense for union and labor organizing. Well, you know, Chris, comrade, you're welcome to come on the show anytime and make that argument. And I agree with you. You know Badiou better than I do at this point. So we'd be honored to have you on to develop that line of inquiry. Okay, so, all right. Okay, now, moving right along here. The next question is a good one, and it is that everything that this person tries to find on Emancipations feels like it's 10 steps ahead, and it feels impossible to understand a number of words and concepts that are used on the channel, such as like the Lacanian discourses or the theory of the death of the father, without knowing what the basics are. So can we create more 101 videos? And I just wanted to ask what you guys think of that. Would you like to see more 101 videos? And if so, what concepts would you like to do? Okay. So, for example, I will be engaging in a 101 video, but it's a little bit more than that, on Stalin's text on Marxism and linguistics. Okay. In collaboration with Reimagining Soviet Georgia, with Brian and Sopo, the hosts of Reimagining Soviet Georgia. You know, none of us are Stalinists, but all of us have an interest in the history of Marxism and socialism. So we want to make, and I checked on YouTube, there is not on YouTube a systematic overview of the significance of Stalin's text on linguistics. It's called Marxism and the Problem of Linguistics, okay? But the truth is, this text changed so much of, I mean, it's honestly, I would say, and if you read Boris Groys, the Communist Postscript, he really focuses a lot on it as changing the direction for the understanding of the relationship between base and superstructure, and finally changing the conception of classes and of class struggle within the Soviet Union. But even more than that, its methodology was adopted by intellectuals such that it split, during the Cold War, it split them in two camps. So it was highly consequential. Now, you may be hearing me say this and be like, why would Stalin write a text on linguistics? I thought that he's like some political leader. Well, the truth is he is a political leader, but he was also a highly well-versed, you know, autodidactic Marxist intellectual. Okay. And so he's responding to a particular linguistic movement called Marxism, right? And so what we're going to do is basically give you guys a sort of total explanation of this. What was Marxism? What was Stalin's text on linguistics all about? What was its impact? Do we still live with its legacy today, as Boris Groys argues? So we are going to do that. I'm a little bit less, I mean, I have to think about how to do the 101 videos. I would rather lecture on a number of concepts as opposed to just giving like, it's just a little too pandering of a model for my style to just be like, you know, the name of the father, you know, or like, you know, the theory of the four discourses, or this is not exactly my style. But we'll come up with something to do there. And then finally, and then I'm going to go to your questions in the chat in a moment. With Matilda, we will be leading a study group starting in September on Polanski's great text, Political Power and Social Classes. And so this is a super interesting, highly influential work that like deeply influences Stuart Hall, deeply influences Laclau. You know, he's writing this after he had attended the Althusserian seminars. It's, you know, probably one of the most important contributions to Marxist class theory in the late 20th century. Okay. The theory of domination, I think Foucault is in the background here. And moreover, the theory of the state. So we will be inviting a public study of Polanski's Political Power and Social Classes starting in September, led by myself and Matilda. So stay tuned for that. It will basically be free, but you can make a contribution to help us as well. And for, you know, you can also support me on Patreon if you find the Emancipations content and stuff valuable, of course. So that concludes the prepared questions. Let me go to the top. I apologize. I hope I didn't go too long. I guess I did, as I always do. Somebody was asking me what I'm reading these days. And, you know, honestly, I have been reading Balzac's Lost Illusions, which I find super nice because the story that it tells is so relatable. It's like this, I don't know, kind of like decadent criminal society where like people don't fit exactly in their socially designated roles, and people's ambitions for their lives are like much higher than they're able to actually actualize. And you see the desire of people, you know, like Jameson always talks about Balzac and desire. Like this text is like dripping with desire, you know, you just feel it when you read it, and you fall in love with these characters very quick. And that's the genius of Balzac. He doesn't need much time to elicit this feeling that you have, that you feel like you know these people. It's very strange. It's very gifted. Yeah, I'm reading also this very interesting autobiography of this Oscar Ameringer, If You Don't Weaken, which, okay, so this guy, he's basically born in the 1860s in Germany. And his father was like oh, what was he? I think he was like some kind of small tradesman. And this story of this man's journey from Germany to the United States is this like miraculous story of contingent accidents. So like he becomes a musician because I think like his mother got him into music. So he becomes a musician. And it was at a time, I think, after the Franco-Prussian War. So there's a lot of repression in his village. And he's on stage once and he sees a peasant getting harassed by the police. So he decides to jump off of stage and like hit the policeman with his instrument. And then he's forced to flee to America because he's running from the cops. And then when he gets to America, he's like working in like a some terrible factory job. And the Knights of Labor come and organize, and he joins up with them, and he goes on a strike with them. And one strike, he had a brick in his hand and he throws it at a police officer, and it like hits the guy in the head. And he didn't go to jail, but he wasn't allowed to work formal labor in that. I think it was in New York. So he has to like flee and go on the run, but he becomes like a kind of a traveling musician. And then it's a story about how this man goes from the Knights of Labor into the Socialist Party USA and becomes this entertainer who becomes a personal friend of Eugene Debs. okay, and is like one of the predominant personalities of the Debsian Socialist Party. And then he also becomes something like an intellectual in the party too. And he's giving like classes on the great German philosophers. It's an incredible autobiography. Yeah, those have been very exciting for me. I mean, other than that, I've just been trying to write a book on Freudian Marxism. So I've just been deeply immersed in that literature. I've also been reading a great book, and I'm going to try to get her on the show, which is Melinda Cooper's Counter-Revolution. So Melinda Cooper, a cabinet maker. Thank you, Matilda. Yes, a cabinet maker. Matilda gave me the book, and when we met in New York, which was very nice. It's an incredible find, Matilda. I'm not done yet, but I'm very much enjoying it. Everyone should read Counter-Revolution by Melinda Cooper. It shows the birth of right-wing populism out of this like supply side economics revolution, and the economists and policymakers that made this happen behind the scenes, right? From Nixon through Carter up to Reagan. And you really, I think, get a sense of class struggle and the way that the blue-collar working class was politicized while at the same time infantilized from the position of their labor rights throughout this whole so-called revolution. And a lot of interesting data and information that I didn't know about the militancy of 1970s wildcat strikes and radicalism in the American labor movement. And it's basically a story about how all of that was decompartmentalized. So for those of you like, Chris and others, and like, many of you are engaged with union work, I think Cooper's Counter-Revolution is essential reading for you too. Hopefully she'll come on the show, because she also wrote that incredible book on the family. Yeah, okay. And so that answers that question. I read a lot of, so it's hard for me to I could just kind of go on, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, so what else do we have here? Yes. Where does the middle class fit in the bourgeoisie and proletariat framework? You're not making a lot of sense with all of your... Oh, right. Well, I sometimes use PMC as a class and middle class as a class, even though in a technical sense, the more precise way to talk about them is as a strata. And so when I write about this, it's different than when I talk about this. Sometimes I use it just as a colloquial term. So if I was imprecise in that regard, I apologize. How does Chris Catrone's campaign for a socialist party square with the critique put forward in your book? And do you plan to have a dialogue like you did the last year? I mean, I don't know how honest I can be. It's very late at night. Well, I can always be honest. That's not the issue. It's just more a matter of sublation and the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm not going to speak ill of them. I'm just not going to do that. Theoretically, there's overlap for sure. We both share a kind of semi-Gramscian focus on pivoting towards a civil society strategy. Do I think, that their leadership orientation will have what it takes to achieve that purported aim? I'm not so sure that it does. I'm not opposed to debating, Chris, but I will say that it would be a debate because we do have a lot of differences. We have a lot of differences in terms of imperialism, how we see the international system, how we see the situation in Palestine and Gaza. We have a lot of differences there that are strong. And we have a lot of different like tactical differences, I think, you know, in how we comport ourselves. And I think one of the main differences that we have, of course, is we both have very different ideas of the left and the status of the left, but also how to critique the left in a way that is productive and healthy. We divert there, I think, in certain ways. So I could say much more, but suffice it to say, I'm not afraid to have a discussion, and I appreciate that question. How do I deal with capitalism infecting every part of my life and ingrained in every part of my being, including my intellect, my thought patterns, and still remain a motivated socialist? Thank you for that. That's very good. Well, I think it's a sort of exteriority. Socialism here is a kind of exteriority that one ideally would align with a sort of a way out of this condition in a certain way. I mean, yes, we acknowledge that the limitations to our social freedom that capitalism imposes on us is total. We acknowledge that. And as such, socialism is a practical strategy for overcoming that, but it's also, you know, an intellectual enterprise to pry into that total codification, you know? So I think that perhaps, and I don't know you personally, and it's hard to therefore respond to this, but if you say that capitalism has affected your intellect and thought patterns, that itself is a very interesting invitation to interrogate. In what sense is this? And you know, the theories of reification of instrumentalized reason from Lukács and Frankfurt School could be extremely useful. If you're saying that those are insufficient, that critique is insufficient, and you may be saying that, that's a different story. Because I do think that we might have to draw a contrast between theory and practice here, which would be valid to some extent. But again, and I'll say this finally, the Frankfurt School always saw theory as efficacious on condition that a strong working class socialist movement creates the backbone of a critical. In other words, I don't think the Frankfurt School saw the project of critique as sufficient to just rely on bourgeois institutions alone, right? So I would say, you know, go read with other socialists in real life, you know, join our study groups. You can begin from there and then see what happens. Okay, now, if I miss any questions, I apologize. I'll just take like one or two more and then we'll call it a night, comrades. This has been very fun and I really enjoyed it. Okay. Yeah, well, let's see. I think that may be, there's so many points here, but I can't find specific. Yes. Well, I hope that you guys join us for the Polansis reading. Oh, I see. Jimbo has an interesting point of view. I don't fully agree with that, but that's fine, Jimbo. No, Jimbo, I don't think that wokeism becomes indistinguishable from fascism. I'm glad that you said that. What wokeism can do to some people is that it can touch an affective register. We see this with TERFs a lot, where they become monomaniacally focused and obsessed with one issue, and it becomes almost like a paranoiac situation. And for that, I do think that both parties need to chill out and like let up a little bit. Like, you know, it's sometimes these things don't qualify as political, and so don't force them in a certain way. No, of course they're not fascist. Of course they're not fascist. If you want to talk about the fascist threat, we are 600 times closer to it with the Peter Thiel Misc moment by a mile. We can still criticize wokeism. It's a matter of degree, you know. It's not an either or. It's not like we are either for it and we cannot be against it. If we are against it, we're not on the left. No, that's not my view. Yeah, the Lukács project for HM is coming along really well. Thank you for asking. I have finished with Matthew Sharp the full introduction, and everything has been submitted. The copy editor has finished copy edits. So that means that it could come out in next month, 2 months. And I am going to be so happy when it does, because it's been 4 years, maybe more, 4 years, in that range, which is a long time for, even for academia, that's a long time. And there's going to be a very cool piece by Lefebvre, Henri Lefebvre, the great French Marxist, in there, which will be cool. It's never before been released, on his reading of Destruction of Reason, you know. Great. Okay. Blessings and comradely love and care to all of you. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's stream, and we will close with a little video, if I can find it. All right, peace out, everybody.